Hello, Feisty Women's Performance Podcast listeners. It's Sarah Gross here, founder and CEO of Feisty Media. And well, it's kind of been a couple months since we've posted a podcast on this feed, but the wait will be worth it, I promise. First, I hope you all took a moment to listen to the Brainstorm series with Celine Yeager and Rebecca Rush. In particular, if you or a loved one have suffered a concussion. Like everything we do here at Feisty, that series is absolutely packed with great information. It includes experts in the field of concussion research, and Rebecca shares her personal story. So if you haven't listened, check that out. It is right here on the Women's Performance feed. Since it's now January 2025, how did it become 2025? I don't know, but we want to start the year off right. So we're going to be producing a few short series, diving into different topics throughout the first half of the year. And we want to start with one of the most important things that underpins so much for active women: fueling. Feisty is focusing on ditching diet culture once and for all and making sure that every woman knows how to enjoy food and use it to fuel our active lives. So we figured, what better way to do that than partner with Zoe and Kylee from the Your Diet Sucks podcast. On the Your Diet Sucks podcast, journalist, comedian, and ultra runner Zoe teams up with dietitian, nutritionist Kylee Horn to create a show that is funny, relatable, and packed with great advice. Over the next 3 weeks, we will be sharing 3 episodes of the Your Diet Sucks podcast right here on the Women's Performance podcast feed. The first episode will cover a topic I know many of you are interested in: the history and science of fasting. The second episode will dive into why diet culture feels so cult-like these days. From paleo to keto, people believe deeply in that stuff. And the third episode will unpack the evolving conversation around orthorexia, a term that is used to refer to an unhealthy obsession with healthy eating. So if you love these episodes, be sure to subscribe to the Your Diet Sucks podcast feed wherever you listen and follow them on Instagram. And if you want to join the hundreds of women who have learned how to fuel their bodies with us, Feisty's online course, Fueled, will be on sale starting in mid-January. So get yourself on the wait list. The link will be in the show notes.
Heads up that this episode discusses eating disorders, disordered eating, and calorie counting and restriction, and that may not be for everyone. That's totally okay. Our advice always is to take care of you, and your media diet can be a diet too.
Welcome to Your Diet Sucks, the podcast that's snack adapted.
I'm Zoe Rome.
I'm Kylee Van Horn.
And I'm definitely snack adapted.
Me
if
too.
Nothing else. Today we're talking about the 0-calorie ultra. I'm not totally sure that I know what this is. Is this like a specific event or what's going on here?
So this idea of doing endurance events with 0 calories.
None calories.
0 calories.
Nary
nothing
a
at all.
calorie. So no, I'm sorry, this is just like blowing my mind. No food at all.
No food at all. Now you can have hydration and electrolytes, but the electrolytes, no calories.
What electrolytes don't have calories?
Those hydration mixes sometimes,
Okay.
like Scratch Labs or Tailwind that have carbohydrates in them, but
Right.
also electrolytes. Those would be calorie containing.
Right.
But the 0 calorie would be electrolytes with either sugar-free like substitutes or just no flavor at all.
That sounds very sad. Okay, so this is an entire ultra run with no calories. Set the stage for us. What's going on here?
This idea came to the forefront back during the pandemic.
When a lot of good ideas in our culture came to the forefront. Really just a breeding ground, for us, for great ideas.
Yeah, exactly. I think
a really rich time in our culture.
Yeah, some people were a little bit bored at the time, I think, and kind of needed to stand out a little bit.
Yeah.
They were looking for new ways to do that during the pandemic.
Races were canceled. A lot of things that endurance athletes, were sort of depending on to make money and to sort of get attention on their personal brands were canceled.
back in 2020, there was a lower carb, high fat athlete that decided to create their own 100-mile course and then do that with 0 calories. They did take fluids and electrolytes, but again, no calories at all.
And it worked?
They were able to finish it in, I believe it was around 18 hours.
Okay, and this is the first time it's ever been done that we know of.
That we know of. I think sometimes there's extreme things attempted that maybe people aren't putting out on social media or talking about.
Well, then what's the point?
Exactly.
If you're going to do something that might be harmful for your entire endocrine system, aren't you going to post about it?
Exactly. This athlete was setting out to maybe test his limits and maybe wanted to gain a little bit of attention at the same time.
Athletes like have to make money, of course, like everyone's incentivized to sort of do things that can help get attention on their personal brand. That in and of itself, I don't think is super new. What I'm curious about is like, what was sort of the media and the cultural response after this happened? Were people into it? Were people against it? What was the conversation like?
At the time, this athlete did get quite a bit of attention. I think it started to point out to people that feel like they're not at like the front of the pack, that maybe, I could do some more extreme things and get some kind of attention.
What this sort of reminds me of is the people that will run a marathon with a pineapple on their head. you know, exactly. Like at a certain point, being in the world of endurance athletics, everyone we know is pretty extreme. Everyone we know is really rigorous and disciplined and does something that most people would consider totally amazing. And it puts a ton of pressure on endurance athletes to continue to differentiate and try to stand out and get more and more extreme to get any sort, as we're all fighting for scraps in the attention economy. I mean, I guess I'm having a hard time understanding how this like adds to the beauty of an event. Again, I go back to just kind of feels like doing a marathon with a pineapple on your head. Like, sure, you can technically do it. And I guess it's the first time it's been done, but why does that make it amazing?
Yeah, I'm not really sure, and I kind of think about, I have conversations with athletes a lot who are maybe trying to do a 200 miler or a 250 and they just keep pushing the distance.
The 300 is now a thing.
I know, that is crazy. But at the same time, it's like, why can we not be enough trying to better ourselves at something like a half marathon?
Right. And so, I mean, and again, like the idea of trying to do it with no calories, I feel like this does sort of fit into a larger cultural trend of people trying to race longer and do more with less. As a registered dietitian nutritionist, is this a trend that you see in your personal practice working with endurance athletes? Are people trying to eke out more and more mileage, volume, whatever it is, with less and less fuel? Does this feel like it's part of a larger story here?
I do see this in one part of my practice. I think for a lot of people, they have a fear of weight gain. That is something where I see a lot of athletes, they'll avoid calories during exercise because they're worried about overconsumption. And then, maybe they're trying to change body composition. Maybe they're trying to change their weight. On the other hand, sometimes people unintentionally are consuming less fuel. Maybe they have lack of hunger cues, et cetera, and they're doing more in their outside life too. Like they're doing more training, but maybe they're doing more extracurricular activities, et cetera, and they don't realize that, I need to match what I'm doing with more fuel. So I feel like there's like an intentional side and an unintentional side to the coin. And then kind of like we were talking about here, maybe more of the like, can I push my limits, like attention side of things.
Right.
I don't necessarily see that all the time in my practice, but
Sure.
Occasionally I will get somebody that's like, I heard about this. Maybe I should try it. Maybe I should test my limits.
Huh. I feel like this kind of reminds me of like the early days of ultra running where it was just like a shirtless dude running 100 miles with a handheld water bottle. And so there is sort of like in our cultural imagination, this understanding that like, man, isn't it just so sick to go a really long way and not like eat anything, only drink water or only like forage for berries and drink from the pure mountain streams that you pass along the way.
I envision that too. I remember hearing stories about certain high level athletes too, just taking a single Snickers bar on a 10-hour endurance adventure. And in my mind, like I can see like maybe it would seem like, oh, I don't want to carry extra. This is a burden to take extra fuel, etc. Luckily, I think the narrative is shifting a little bit and athletes are starting to realize, oh, like there's another side to this coin that I could actually push my fueling limits a little bit.
Yeah, I guess like when it comes down to it for me, as inconvenient as it is to bring 2 whole Snickers bars on my run, devastating sacral stress fractures are like way worse in my hierarchy of things I want to avoid. But I sort of so for this episode, I did a bunch of research on the cultural history of fasting, so to sort of help put this in context. And almost every single faith tradition has aspect of fasting in it. And fasting has been connected to asceticism and this idea of getting closer to things that are holy or things that are sacred by rejecting the body and rejecting the needs of the body. I actually read an old diary entry from Benjamin Franklin where he was like, I fasted all day, eating nothing but bread and drinking nothing but beer. And I was like, that's my guy. That's how I want to fast. I just want to do the beer and bread fast. So if anyone needs me, I'll be doing my beer fast after this. But, it's always also been something that has sort of been connected to an intellectual history as well. Pythagoras was super into fasting, Socrates, Plato. And honestly, I feel like back in the day, these guys definitely would have had their own like wonky triangle sort of fasting podcast, like would have been like the toga version of Huberman Labs. And, I think something else that's important to talk about when we look at the history and the culture of fasting is that historically men who have fasted, like these toga bros that I was talking about, Benjamin Franklin, spiritual leaders, we see stories of Jesus, the Buddha fasting. Men who have historically fasted have been vaulted as intellectual and spiritual leaders. Historically, women that have fasted have either been cast as like super vain or superficial, excluding the women who die historically of fasting. There's an entire sort of Catholic tradition of and I'm putting this in the heaviest quotation marks imaginable, anorexia mirabilis, which is what happens when you die of fasting as a woman and become a lady saint. So, 2 paths to enlightenment there. But again, I think that it shows that there has always been a gendered double standard around calorie restriction as a means to enlightenment or cultural superiority. It's always been sort of something that men are allowed to do and be cultural and intellectual leaders, and women will either die or be seen as vain or like annoying harpies like the suffragettes who fasted in order to bring attention to their cause. So I think it's just important to sort of put into context that historically this has always been a part of the human experience. Every faith tradition practices this. I think that there can be upsides to understanding it, but I do think it's worth acknowledging that we've always had a really troubled connection with calorie restriction as a means of denying the body. And when we put this in the light of endurance sports, I think it's really important to say, like, is that really a helpful story for us to bring into this space? Is that cultural baggage helpful for the aims and goals that we have here? Or is this something that we should examine and discard?
And now that you're bringing that up, just in my practice, those that I feel like I've worked with that have been involved with fasting are more men. I actually don't get as many women that fast or are promoting fasting. And so that's an interesting point that you're bringing up because I've definitely seen that play out.
Yeah, although like back in the day when I used to follow Gwyneth Paltrow on Twitter, she's really into like her version of like goopy lady fasting, which definitely sort of feels like a part of this. But again, I think it's like our culture sees men that do these extreme things with diets and they're just biohacking. They're testing the limits of human capability. But when women do it, we're vain, we're pathologized. And so I think that that's sort of a really interesting through line that I want to tug on here, especially when we start unpacking the sort of physiological context and the biological differences between sexes when it comes to restriction. I think that it's interesting. There is a physiological difference because we see culturally there's a difference between how gender and these practices relate. I just don't understand why people do this. Why do people from these groups who are trying these things, what do they say the purpose is here?
So there's a number of different maybe arguments that people will make for fasting.
When you say arguments, it really does feel like I feel like it's really hard to hear any of these counterpoints without it very much having the tone of like a saucy DM.
Yeah, because a lot of them are not fully backed up by research.
They're not?
So I think a lot of them are anecdotal.
Oh my God. Okay. So what are the anecdotes here?
Well, first, let's talk about the fasting piece, because I think there's kind of two sects, like as far as doing like extreme, maybe low carb, high fat versus like fasting in general. And with fasting in general, looking at possible performance benefits, possibility to oxidize fat a little bit better, which might extend your glycogen stores during exercise.
The face that you're making as you say this makes me question how much this is backed by evidence. Are there any studies that show that fasting improves fat oxidation in athletes?
Yes.
Okay.
To some extent.
Okay.
But I think the research isn't fully clear here. And we'll get to the downsides or the possible downsides. And I think when we look at it, we do need to consider, there are some significant downsides here that can happen. And if you're engaging in these practices, is the risk worth a potential small reward?
Right. Because even just the nature of endurance training improves your ability to oxidize fat.
Exactly.
So
and that's the big argument that I always make.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
So, go do your training, athletes. Come on.
Yeah. Okay. Improved ability to oxidize fat. What else do people say are the benefits of fasting and endurance exercise? And this is like not taking in calories during. Let's put this in context. Like what practice are we specifically talking about here?
Could have different contexts, I guess.
Cool.
There's an idea where you would do a training session and then you wouldn't eat carbohydrates before your second training session, and then you would go and do that second training session on low carbohydrate availability.
Yeah.
And then there's the idea of like maybe doing longer training sessions with no calories at all. There's a couple of different, I guess, methods to when we're looking at using fasting as like a tool for performance.
Sure. So to just get ready for this podcast, and you saw this, you bore witness to me consuming on the spot about $18 worth of carryout from the Whole Foods hot bar. I'm not even recording a podcast fasted. That is how, I guess, snack adapted I am at this point.
Amazing.
This is peak human performance you're witnessing. I'm pushing the barriers of how many animal cookies can be eaten while recording a podcast.
I had some nice sugary Starbucks as well, which is also equally amazing.
Yeah, high carb, love it. So what about mitochondrial function? What are the potential benefits there?
When we look at mitochondrial function, to kind of boil it down, improved mitochondrial function would allow for you to maybe have a more efficient energy production when you're exercising.
Right. And that might be tight. Like there could be a way that fasting improves that.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Cool. What else are folks saying that this helps?
Well, I kind of want to go in and switch gears to the low carb, high fat option too, because again, there's
pivoting from fasting to the low carb, high fat.
Yeah. And so what I want to make it clear that like both of these modalities are extremes.
Right. Yes.
And so
cutting out an entire macronutrient is extreme, no matter what your TikTok says.
I mean, even if somebody is consuming some carbohydrates, but like consuming very little, that is still an extreme when we're looking at endurance exercise too.
So is the argument that both LCHF, low carb, high fat, and fasting can help improve similar things? Or are they different? I feel like I don't fully understand the difference.
Yeah, so they're different.
Okay. As soon as you tell me I can't eat something, I just tune out.
Yeah, so, slightly different, I guess. So as far as low carb, high fat goes, like the argument there that would coincide with fasting would be improved fat oxidation.
Check. All right.
Then when we look at the difference with low carb, high fat, there are some people that will say, it decreases their gastrointestinal distress during long ultra events. And I'm not going to deny like that could be a legitimate thing.
Right. But, I guess to push back, can't restricting also increase the occurrence of gastrointestinal distress? Can't that be a symptom of energy deficiency?
It can, but when we're under the assumption maybe that these people are consuming the right amount of energy intake, but maybe they're using fat and protein or something as an energy source.
I do wonder if there's it could be that people get stuck sort of in a cycle of not eating enough so that when they do eat on their runs, it doesn't feel good in their tummies because they're not eating enough. So they eat even less. So it, sort of like a negative feedback loop of diarrhea and underfueling.
Yeah. So I think you bring up a good point, because when you are engaging in extreme dietary practices, it can make it a lot more difficult to meet your energy needs.
Right.
And then this is where, I think some of the confusion that you were maybe stating comes in, is that sometimes I find that low-carb, high-fat athletes also are fasting. So they're, engaging in similar practices.
They remind me of that, the emoji of, shaking hands, and the things they love is, cutting stuff out of their diet and arguing online, and then they just meet in the middle, And I feel again, it just becomes so dogmatic. And I feel again, I just get really confused about the overlap, because I feel like these groups have such a strong overlapping identity that just to me feels pretty alienating. But again, I am genuinely curious about what research exists out there. It also seems like there is a lot of evidence that maybe some of the stuff isn't that good for us. Could you walk me through some of the reasons that maybe people should not fast?
Well, and this is kind of where we get into, you might not realize what's happening to you until it's too late.
Oh boy.
I really like the quote. David Roche wrote an article back in 2021 for Trail Runner magazine, where he was examining fasting and whether it would have performance benefits for female athletes. And he had a quote in there that said, "At its best, indiscriminate fasted running risks making athletes more efficient at being slightly inefficient. And at its worst, fasted running can cause health crises," which I find to be very true. And I've seen the fallout from people, and unfortunately, they don't realize, athletes don't recognize it until it's too late.
So when you talk about health crises, are we saying mental, physical? What specifically does this look like in practice?
I would say everything.
Wow. Okay. So what specifics do you tend to see in your work?
Oftentimes I see impacts on thyroid health. So I've had a lot of people be diagnosed with hypothyroidism and be put on medication only to work on eating more carbs later, and they can get off of medication. And I'm not denying that people shouldn't take medication for certain health conditions. But
if there is a root cause in diet, then it's probably helpful to suss that out and address that as well.
Exactly. And I remember a particular athlete that I had last year, and it was actually a female athlete that was engaging in low-carb, high-fat diet practices as an ultra runner. And was put on thyroid medication. And when she came to me, she was like, "I really don't want to be on this med, and I'm just worried about my health." And so we worked on increasing her carbohydrate consumption in 3 months, which is actually kind of a short period of time for thyroid hormone turnaround. She was able to get off the medication because she just hadn't been eating enough carbohydrate.
So, it sounds like while maybe some people anecdotally might perform or feel that they perform well with minimal or no carbohydrate, there's definitely an entire subset of the population for whom that is not true. What else do you see in populations that have fasted or engaged in low carb, high fat practices? What are the long term? Actually, I want to know what the short term health impacts are.
And again, we're kind of getting a little muddled with low carb intake and then fasted training. And I think when we look at not taking in any calories during an ultra, one of the bigger risks that I see, and a red flag for me when I've seen this, is this person at risk for rhabdomyolysis? Are their kidneys going to be damaged? So that's essentially extreme muscle protein breakdown as a result of, doing something hard exercise-wise. That could be a contributing factor. And then, when we don't take in calories, then our body starts to break down, whatever we've got. So yes, you'll oxidize and break down fats, but also you're breaking down your muscle.
You might be breaking down some less choice things as well. Like, you can't just decide where your body gets energy from, right? Like, it would be great if all it did was like pull from fat stores, but that's not really how the body works. Like, does it pull from everything indiscriminately, or is there like a hierarchy of places it will pull from?
Typically, it is going to be like when we're exercising, we're typically going to be utilizing some carbohydrate.
Sick.
And then so our glycogen stores, and then exogenous sources of carbs.
Love exogenous carbs.
Yes, me too. And then you're going to be utilizing fat as well, or fat oxidation.
So it's like your body is making itself a tasty cocktail of snacks coming in and snacks it found lying around in your, just in your body.
Yes, exactly.
Like me making dinner.
Exactly.
Love it.
So then when we don't have carbohydrates available, the body will start breaking down muscle mass and trying to use that for energy production. And both fat breakdown and muscle breakdown for energy production are more inefficient at producing energy overall. That's again why I'm like, why do this type of extreme?
Because it's inefficient and it's literally breaking down your bones and muscle, which for me, that's an undesirable outcome, but also it totally sounds like, again, me panicked making dinner when I haven't done the chore of getting exogenous groceries, and I just start making shit with whatever's in the fridge. And that's how we end up with like rye bread with day old like mustard on it.
I've been there.
It's not pretty.
Random concoctions.
That leads to household partnership breakdown, which is an inefficient energy source in my relationship. So, I mean, that sounds like pretty extreme. So that's like things that can lead to stress fractures, bone injury, but also I'm imagining it can really impact hormone health. Like, what about cortisol?
When we look at low carb intake and then even the fasted, not doing any calories coming in, when we exercise, we know that cortisol levels do naturally go up. But when we look at like no calorie or low carb intake, that can raise cortisol levels even higher than normal. And so some cortisol, like it's a natural response. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But when it maybe tips over the edge is where it can become a problem, and it can lead to bone breakdown, bone resorption. And then when we look at other hormones, particularly there have been some studies that have showed that even with meeting your energy needs, if you have low carb availability, meaning you're not taking in enough carbohydrate to meet your training needs, then you can have decreased progesterone levels and decreased estrogen levels. And we know that like estrogen is that bone protector. So
hell yeah.
I really want to reduce my estrogen levels,
So metal. I love that estrogen is the hormone that keeps our bones rock solid. Shout out to estrogen. You rock.
If 2024 taught us anything, it was that a fueled athlete will get the best out of her body every time. From record-setting performances to learning to embrace strong, powerful bodies, the best athletes were the ones who nailed their nutrition on a daily basis. But good fueling isn't just for elite athletes. It's maybe even more important for busy women like you who are balancing all the stresses of life. Good fueling is the way you maximize all that hard work you're putting into your training. And it's how you have the energy to focus at work, to be present with your family, to meet your goals, to do all the things that you want to do this year. And that's why we're kicking off 2025 with our popular Feisty Fueled course. We created this course for active women who want to go deep into all the things that impact the ways we fuel our body, like the narratives living rent-free in our head around food, understanding how our body uses food to power our training in our lives, understanding how those hormones impact nutrition, and how to recognize underfueling and what you can do about it. And then we top it all off by giving you the tools you need to create a nutrition plan that works for your goals and for your lifestyle. It's not about following a diet. It's about understanding what you need to live your strongest, healthiest, and most feisty life this year. Enrollment for this course is open from January 10th through 22nd and will kick off our community the week of January 27th. To learn more or sign up, head over to womensperformance.com/fueled or check out the link in the show notes.
That sounds like that can really lead to some like long-term impacts. Are there any studies sort of looking at what like the long-term implications of engaging in or of having these sort of like low carb availability or low energy availability?
First off, I want to point out that low energy availability, disordered eating, eating disorders, it's been shown that up to 60% of endurance athletes have some form of disordered eating. So, when thinking about engaging in these extreme practices with your diet, like I would be super cautious.
I mean, to me, honestly, like, again, knowing that the population, and like I fall into this category, right? Like I've been in eating disorder recovery for many years. So I know that I'm like hypersensitive to a lot of these narratives. But it just feels like people who are promoting extreme diets, particularly in the world of endurance sports, it feels like bringing in an open container to an AA meeting, right? Like we are already shown to be a really sensitive population and you're just like walking in with a grenade. You are speaking to the people who are going to be the most susceptible and have the most challenge with a lot of this really messed up messaging. And maybe, messed up is too strong of a word here. Like even if you feel in your heart that you have a good faith message, it just has to be acknowledged that our specific population really self-selects for people who already sort of have an inclination towards extremity, towards perfectionism, towards all these things that sort of dispositionally leave us at a higher risk for eating disorders, disordered eating, and we're all exercising a ton. So then our risk of low energy availability is just sky high.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest problem that I have with promotion of these extremes, these extreme dietary practices, is that we have, as endurance athletes, we have more susceptibility towards disordered eating, eating disorders. And even if it works for one person, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be good for everyone. Totally. And then I or other sports dietitians can kind of see that fallout, and it's really unfortunate. I work with over 50% of my athletes have some, I would say, form of disordered eating, eating disorders, REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport. And the common theme is that they don't recognize that where they were at until they're there, I guess.
Right.
So this messaging to do, 100 miles with no calories, or to do like extreme low carb, again, like you were saying, might be in good faith, but unfortunately, a lot of people are going to end up in a very bad place.
Right. Like I feel like these sort of narratives need to be heavily contextualized. I can't tell people what to do with their lives, but I do feel like it's worth taking a step back and looking at how we use the media and social media to, again, promote these narratives of extremity. Because it's not going to break the internet if someone goes out and runs an ultra while fueling effectively. Unfortunately, that's not really news. So these things that feel really attention grabby, I think often, like, again, maybe they can be recognized as being a feat of some kind, but I also feel like it is worth heavily caveating and saying, like, what are we actually praising here? Are we really praising a feat of endurance, or are we really drawn to this narrative as a culture because it fits into our preconceived notions about like what is good and what is bad? And we, again, like looking at the historical context of fasting, we have long as a people had a fascination with doing less, with not consuming anything, and with the rejection of food. And I feel like that these are narratives worth critiquing and worth trying to understand why we feel drawn to them and how we might counteract them with more evidence-based narratives and more compassionate narratives going forward.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm going to go back to what we were talking about, because I think it's important to kind of highlight the long-term effects like you were talking about. Right. And the biggest issues that I see are bone health issues, and bone health issues from the respect of it being like a stress fracture, or maybe you completely break a bone or something, but also osteopenia, osteoporosis. And even if you haven't broken anything yet, one of my mentors in the eating disorder space has said, tell an athlete they're one hip break away from a career-ending injury.
Right.
And I hate fear tactics sometimes, but sometimes when I use that with an athlete, it is kind of like this eye-opening moment that they're like, whoa, okay.
Yeah.
I really don't want that to happen when I'm like 30 or even when I'm 80. But at the same time, when I'm 30, I don't want to be breaking my hip.
Yeah, whenever I'm out on a run with my partner TJ and someone like takes a fall or rolls an ankle and then pops right back up, we always yell pizza bagels because it is our partnership goal to always stay at minimum one pizza bagel ahead of injury.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that.
Pizza bagels.
That's awesome. So yeah, I think the bone health implications are one of the biggest reasons to maybe be really cautious, if not avoid completely doing these dietary extremes. And then when I look at athletes that I've worked with that have relative energy deficiency in sport, I'm thinking of a particular athlete that I started working with a couple of years ago that's in her 50s, and she had a completely messed up GI system, which the Mayo Clinic couldn't even figure out what was going on. She had a bunch of injuries crop up, and she started having really weird energy issues, heart issues. She would have fainting episodes out on runs, and it wasn't until later that we discovered, oh, yeah, she was on a 1,200 calorie diet that her running coach, her previous running coach had prescribed. So, and she didn't realize that this was a bad thing. And her coach was suggesting that she do this for weight loss.
Dude, if you're an athlete and you're eating less calories a day than a Chipotle burrito, you need a different coach. I know that's a really big statement, but dear God.
No, I know. And the hard part was that she was engaging in these practices to lose weight. And whenever she would go to Mayo Clinic or a doctor, they would never consider relative energy deficiency in sport because of the way that she looked or her weight.
Oh,
so that's really unfortunate,
Stay tuned for our forthcoming episode, 90 minutes of Zoe and Kylee ranting about how the medical establishment doesn't properly address eating disorders in people of different body presentations.
So I think, it's a great example of she didn't really know what she was doing or what was going on with her until she hit rock bottom. And for her, long-term health implications, I still keep in touch with this athlete, and 2 years later, she is still struggling. She can barely run 20 minutes right now.
Oh,
it's actually really sad.
Yeah. And I feel something else that I'm really interested in here is we know, I think, again, I feel specifically LCHF is something that seemed would you say that it's more popular amongst male athletes than female? It kind of feels like it's something that the very online dude bros of endurance running are very into.
Yes, although I have in
just
some
as
groups,
a trend. Yeah.
In some groups, I have seen some women engaging in it, and in my own practice, I would say
shout out to the ladies. We can have internalized misogyny too.
And in my practice, I feel like I haven't had a ton of women that are kind of trying to dig themselves out of the intentional low carb, high fat diet hole and switching over. More of the athletes I get are male athletes that are switching from low carb, high fat to eating carbohydrates again because it was inconvenient for them to do low carb, high fat.
Which hella inconvenient.
I'm I love my carbs.
Do you think there's a way where maybe low carb, high fat, or fasting can be sort of a way of people to not have eating disorders or disordered eating get diagnosed, because it sort of gets this veneer of scienciness, right? There's all this evidence and all these like flashy terms, and you can use charts to determine when you should fast or not. When in reality, I think people are really using some of these practices in the same way that people will use eating disorders and disordered eating as a means of sort of speaking to an emotional state and of trying to regain a sense of control in their lives.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, when we look at eating disorders and disordered eating, it's actually typically not about the food. It's about like things outside in the world or emotional or stress or trauma that is coming up. And then the diet acts as that form of stability and control.
Right.
And so this is, again, to the point we were making earlier, the problem that I have with these extremes and with, promoting no-calorie ultras and promoting that low-carb, high-fat is the only way. That sort of thing can be extremely dangerous for people that are prone to this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, even taking a step back, like, yes, you and I have a lot of fun talking about how much we enjoy carbohydrates. You'll also notice I'm not being prescriptive in my language around it because I believe that these things are highly personal and should be guided by, a work with a team of professionals for people. And it has to be individualized, and like, that high carb life works quite well for me. Thank you for asking. But again, like, I don't feel comfortable pushing my diet onto other people. And I feel like my primary issue comes when these kind of scary and extreme things become not just a way of life for some people, but something that becomes like an entire identity. And you're either in or you're out, and you're with us or against us. And you are better and more moral and good and worthy of attention and connection in our community if you eat in a certain way.
Yeah, no one wants to take that non-sexy approach, Zoe.
I know. Come to the carb side. We have bagels. So, something that I'm really curious is, do you see the narrative? So again, we talked about this sort of coming to a head maybe during the pandemic, but I also feel like there has been a lot of good research lately and a lot of really positive conversations on the opposite side of things. Like, I just think about like looking at my social media feeds, and I see a lot of particularly strong female athletes talking about how much they're eating during ultras. They're bragging about how many gels they eat. They're sharing their fueling plans for accountability. And again, not being prescriptive, which is where I'm like yeeting out of there. But I just wonder, like, in your work, because you work, again, like with a self-select group of people who, like, when people identify that they maybe need a little support, they reach out. But do you see the cultural narrative shifting to maybe move away from the, like, instead of trying to do more with less, what if we tried to do more also with more?
I think the tough part is that we maybe live a little bit in an echo chamber. I'm going to be fully transparent here.
In a high carb echo chamber. Could that be because I live in an Einstein's Bagels, do you think?
Potentially.
It's
Gummy
a good
worms.
echo chamber. Yeah.
The candy shop.
Yeah. My echo chamber is the clearance aisle of City Market.
Yes, that Easter candy.
You know what? They're still selling it. I'm going to keep showing up every weekend.
But really, I feel encouraged in my echo chamber because I do see a lot more questions coming up about, what are your thoughts on pushing over 90 grams of carbs an hour? What are your thoughts on like what is the optimal amount of carbohydrates that I should be pushing? And so a lot of questions about pushing the fueling limits versus that restriction piece. Which again, I may have self-selected here, but that's encouraging. I think to your point, we do need to be a little bit careful when we're talking about pushing the fueling limits too, though, because then I think the messaging comes out that like, this is the only way. You have to do over 90 grams of carbs an hour. And I have found that might not work the best for some endurance athletes. They might live at a better spot at 60 grams of carbs an hour. You know?
Gosh, it's almost like we're all in unique, special little snowflakes that need perfectly tailored training plans.
Oh, Yeah. I mean,
fueling plans.
I'm pushing the gummy worms all the way. That's
how many grams of gummy worm are you taking in per hour during exercise? And are we talking sour gummy worm or like traditional gummy worm?
Oh, sour gummy worms.
Yeah,
all the way.
I love a normal gummy worm, just living my life. But like when I'm exercising, I need now my mouth is watering just thinking about it. The citric acid, like
that salivary.
I don't like the
production there. Yeah. No, probably over 60 grams for sure of gummy worms.
Do you think we can get a trolley sponsorship for the pod?
That would be amazing.
Yeah, trolley.
Yeah. Oh, that would be amazing.
Shout out to Trolley. You know where to find us.
They don't make the sour watermelons. No, that's the Sour Patch.
Those are Sour Patch people.
Brand, I guess.
Yeah.
Man, those things are amazing.
Yeah.
Sour Patch watermelons.
I've been, again, just in the not trying to be prescriptive here, but I have experimented with a wide range of gummy things while running. And the one that is just a no-go for me is the shark, It's just trying to fit an entire gummy shark in your mouth at one time is a lot. Also, the white gummy, I don't know what flavor it is. I don't know if it's like a coconut or if it's just like truly like pig flavored. Yeah, I know even your face, you're like, no way.
Pineapple flavored, maybe?
Oh, I don't do pineapple. Oh, I don't fuck with fake pineapple. Fake pineapple and shark. Ugh.
That sounds disgusting.
It's the shark flavoring that I'm just not into. I like real shark, thank you.
Yeah, no.
I prefer authentic shark experience.
The vegan shark experience.
My next podcast and my dismantled jam band. We definitely are seeing people push the other side of it. But I'm curious, like, what narratives would you like to see sort of counteract this? Like, what do you think is helpful for people to hear who are curious about trying to do more with less?
The non-sexy messaging.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's where the problem comes in because people want the hack or the sensationalized approach that is going to give them a 50% performance boost or something,
right.
But in reality, I, of course, want to promote a tailored, personalized fueling plan that's going to work for you.
So you know exactly how many gummy sharks to eat per hour of endurance activity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we're avoiding those, remember?
That's right.
So
unless that's what you're into, in which case go with God.
I like for my athletes to think about 60 to 90 grams of carbs an hour. If you want to try to push above that, great. But I don't think that everyone should be trying to push above that and cause stomach distress for yourself.
You don't need to fly too close to the carb sun.
Exactly. And then on the other side of things, I will say some of my endurance athletes that are doing ultras, they do a little bit better with 40 to 50 grams of carbs. And this requires experimentation. I think overall, though, looking at proper calorie intake during your long training sessions is really important. So I'm not saying don't consume any carbs at all.
Right.
I'm saying there's a range and you've got to figure out what's going to work best for you, your performance, your gut, and then make the choices that make the most sense for you based on, what you're trying to get at.
Yeah. And I think that that's like the primary difficulty that we're trying to grapple with here is that things like giving evidence-based ranges and saying that it needs to be individualized and that it maybe shouldn't be a part of your identity is not very sexy messaging. And that's not going to really perform on social media or, sort of in our current attention economy where all the incentives are to be extreme, to be dogmatic, to have your entire identity be what you eat and what that says about you.
I think it's tough because I think people almost want to have that identity in a sense,
like with so their diet. I wish I didn't have to work so hard to develop a personality and I could just be like the queen of the gummy shark people. Like that would be a super fun cult. Hit me up if you want to join. But yeah, I think that that's not very healthy. And I think it's symptomatic of a much larger issue that folks are grappling with.
Things to think about are, how are you being influenced by maybe other athletes that are promoting the extremes on social media before you engage in these practices is the thing. So again, like we're not trying to maybe single out one person, one athlete, because there are a lot of people that are trying things like low carb, high fat.
I mean, we're all trying shit, like we're all just throwing shit at our own personal walls to see what sticks.
Yeah. And then, on the other side of things, there's people pushing 120 grams of carbs an hour. So those are like extreme carb intake people during exercise.
Yeah.
And I don't think you have to like fully box yourself into one of these categories to be a successful athlete or to be someone that performs well. You can kind of live in the middle a little bit.
Yeah. So what that actually makes me think of, sort of circling back to our conversation about how fasting has always been a part of culture and particularly faith traditions. I had been reading about fasting in Buddhism, and Siddhartha Buddha, he started his career off earlier in his career fasting, and then actually moved away and started to reject his practice of fasting because he found that when he wasn't taking in food, he couldn't engage in his spiritual life the way that he wanted to. So he started not fasting, and he started doing something that he called the middle path, which was like not engaging in overconsumption, was still trying to be mindful and like consume and eat in a way that felt good to him, but was rejecting the unhealthy denial of the body and was trying to find that balance between spiritual and physical, between the intellectual and the body. And the middle path really resonated with me because something that really helped me in my eating disorder recovery process was realizing that I needed to feed myself just so I could show up and be present in my life, to be present for other people, to help other people. Even when it was hard for me to figure out how to try to help myself, I was always motivated by trying to help others. And I feel like that's something that can really resonate with other people. There is a middle way. And is it sexy? No. Is it going to get you a ton of likes on TikTok? Also no, but it seems like a much more authentic and sort of values-based way to proceed with this and to just decide for yourself what makes sense for you, your athletic goals, and your background, and to just really question and feel comfortable critiquing these narratives that we need to reject the body, that we need to do more with less, that's the most admirable and pure thing to do. You into it? You with me? Do you want to go get some gummy sharks?
I'm going to go get some sour gummy worms.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Kylee. Can't wait to chat with you next week.